Good afternoon, evening, morning, whatever time it is you're watching this show. Thank you for coming back to the Sound Horizons podcast. I'm Rick. You knew that, but I'm telling you anyway because I'm a gentleman. Today's guest is an amazing human being, a wonderful scholar, I don't even know how many wonderful adjectives I can throw into one description, but whichever ones I haven't used yet, you apply them liberally. Today we're going to speak with producer, engineer, and music enthusiast, your friend and mine. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Mr. James Farber. Hi, James.
Hey, Rick.
It's never easy to do those transitions. I talk about it all the time. It's such a weird, stupid, necessary part of making a video or doing anything. So thanks for bearing with that awkward transition.
Oh, no problem. I'm technically not a producer.
Oh, come on. I mean, a little bit. You wouldn't consider yourself a producer, kind of?
I mean, you're a producer if your employer calls you a producer. That's not my title. I have been credited with associate producer on some records. And in 1981 or 82, I was credited with being the producer on a crazy record that nobody heard. So, but really just an engineer.
Okay, fair enough. I'll stand corrected, although... You
can call me a producer. It's fine.
In my defense, when you look through your album credits to try and source through, and none of the sites do a good job of keeping track of anything, but even just the sheer volume of material you've had the opportunity to work on, it would be difficult for any human being with working eyes to not think at some point in time you were everything on a record, that you that you were the custodian, the food guy, the drum. Like, you have worked on so many projects, and that's kind of where I wanted to start because
I've had a really varied career.
And the background for that career, which is unique for someone like yourself, has the majority, if not all, please correct me if I'm wrong, has been in New York. Is that correct? I mean, you've had the opportunity to basically, that's your home. That's it.
I've never gone anywhere else.
Wow.
Yeah, our colleague Neil Dorfsman of one of the early Toontrack projects, who says hello, always tells me that I've had the most diverse career of anybody, and it's sort of true. Although now it's a little bit more narrow, but there have been a lot of different things over the years for sure.
Well, I was going to start with that. I mean, ultimately, I think in interviews you've done and in things you've shared in the past, your love of jazz music has been very well documented. And you're a true fan of the genre, and you have been, from what I understand, most of your life. Is that correct?
Oh yeah. Ever since high school, I started taking some piano lessons, which I never practiced at, but my teacher was a jazzer, and I got introduced to it, and all my high school buddies thought I was a jazz snob, which I guess I was. But I jazz and Frank Zappa. Let's put it that way. Yes. And so yeah, it's something that grabbed me right away, and eventually I became somewhat of a player on piano, and that led me to I knew I was never going to be a musician for a career because A, I had really small hands, and B, I never practiced, and who wanted to schlep a Rhodes up 3 flights of stairs at the end of the gig back in the 70s? So, but the training from playing music, of course, was invaluable, as it is to everybody who's in any way connected with this biz.
So you start as a player, and you think obviously you're already in the minority as a young person growing up in the 60s and the 70s. You're the guy that likes the jazz and Zappa, and not, rock and roll has kind of taken hold of the world at that point in time. You've got your Zeppelins and the Who, and everybody, the Stones are kind of killing it. So you move into the jazz space, and as you're moving into that space, was there one particular artist or band that was like, wait a minute, what's this? I need more of this. Was there one that did it for you?
There was an album that my aunt gave me. It was a compilation. I wish I had taken it to here and held it up. It was called Fill Your Head with Jazz. And 25 songs. It was a Columbia release of every famous jazz artist you could ever imagine. So I heard them all at once. And then when I started taking piano lessons around that same time, my teacher said, go to the library and take out records by Art Tatum, Oscar Peterson, Bill Evans, and Errol Garner. He said these
Wow.
are for his four favorite players. So that's kind of where I started. Of course, I took out Charlie Parker records and John Coltrane records, and it all started from there. But that Fill Your Head with Jazz record was really something that introduced me to like a zillion artists at once.
Now, were you acutely aware as you were starting to get more into your heroes and the types of jazz you like that so much of it was actually coming from New York? Was that something you were cognizant of, or is that just sort of circumstantial to you?
I don't think I paid that much attention to that. I mean, there was a lot coming out of Detroit and Newark and Canada and
Sure.
other places. So that's something that wasn't on my radar. But I knew I was in the place where the music was played,
Yeah. Yeah.
even if it didn't
That's a big
originate.
deal. Yeah. So
Yeah.
you
Like
get to,
in high school, I would drive into the city and go to the Vanguard, sit at the bar and hear, whoever it was, Bill Evans, George Russell,
wow.
Thad and Mel's big band. I
You did it. You took the excursion. You went for it. You
I
had to
was
go see
into
it.
it, yeah. And I didn't completely stop listening to rock and popular music. I mean, there was a lot of stuff I liked. I'm not putting anything down. So
No.
I just it just wasn't my first love.
Sure. Well, and that also brings up kind of this interesting career transition. So obviously, we fast forward now to like that late '70s, and you have now matriculated. You're in the studio scene, the New York studio scene, to some extent. This is what you're going to do, at least for now, and you're working on some jazz, trying to get some jazz, working with artists. And we're going to come back to that, but then early '80s, you take a turn. So somehow the jazz gets turned a little, and then you end up working in a part of the '80s with some of the biggest and most well-known artists of that time, working for Nile Rodgers as an engineer. Was that crazy for you, or did you see that happening as a result of your career trajectory?
A lot of this happened because I started working at Power Station, and the client list there was, cream of the crop. Nile was one of the first clients, and so I had been doing for a few years Haitian compa records. I made hundreds of them, and that was my thing. I did that every week for a couple of years. I was the
Wow.
specialist, and then one day the office called me and said, Nile is working on a. I had assisted on because I only assisted for like a year, but I had assisted on some of the Chic Sister Sledge sessions and all that. So Nile knew everybody there, and it was like a little family. But a call came down from the office that Nile was working on Mick Jagger's first solo record. She's the boss, and
Mm-hmm.
they said, and Mick and the engineer aren't getting along. So Nile said, we need a replacement, and you're the only one available. So tomorrow you're starting with Nile and Mick on this record. So but there was a time when now it's staff engineers are more common because of budgets. But back then, when I started out, it was almost only staff engineers. And then in the middle '80s, things started drifting towards more of a freelance thing. But yeah, so I started working with Niall on that. We got along great. Then I worked with him for 3 years, but only during the week. And on weekends, I'd make jazz records.
And so you're working through these other pop and rock and again, you're like you said, your discography is pretty varied. I mean, obviously there's an emphasis on jazz, sure, but there's these windows where you've worked with some of these again, kind of for lack of a better term, household names. As an engineer, were you finding procedures and skills and tools in the pop sessions or the rock sessions that you would then later go on to start using or maybe experiment with in some of your jazz sessions?
I was trained by rock and pop engineers. So Clearmountain, Neil, Dorfsman, Scott Litt, Tony Bongiovi, those were the people who trained me. So, I started out, EQing the shit out of everything, and, treble crazy and all that kind of stuff. And some of that I carried over into my early jazz recordings. But as I got better and as I started working with the best jazz musicians, I began to realize that these folks hone their skills on their instruments for years, and that I did not need to do anything. I just needed to find the right mic, put it in the right place, capture it, balance it, pan it. So I became a minimalist because over time, I thought I want to give more control to the musicians, and I just want to go along for the ride. But with for instance, when I was working with Nile, one of the most complex records we did was Thompson Twins, Here's to Future Days.
Yeah.
And each mix took 3 days, and it was, 48 tracks of dense information and, lots of effects. And, it was like, how do we know when it's done? Somebody's going to say it's done, but you keep going. And of course, in the jazz world, I have to work so fast that, if I get 2 hours to mix a song, it's a lot.
Sure.
And I do a lot of live 2-track mixing too. Anyway, I'm straying, but so it all became intertwined. But I would say I became more of a minimalist over time and less of a processor as I switched. And even the pop records that I continued to do, after that, were mostly musicians who wanted it to sound like a real band playing in a room, not like a manufactured kind of thing, which is why me as a jazz engineer was considered and appropriate for those records. Sure. I think.
So
James Taylor is an example of that.
Oh, okay. Wow. You bring up a great point. So I'm curious if you rewind just a single bit. So you're working on all these Haitian style records for a while, and then you get this call to do the Mick Jagger record, and so you have this opportunity. Do you immediately hone in on the difference in the process? Meaning, as you said, most jazz records are cut from the floor, 1-2 takes, it's the band playing, versus now you go to this pop world where everything's overdubs and time. Was that an odd transition for you, or were you sort of already acutely aware of it?
No, I was trained, to in that world. So it was really, it wasn't foreign at all. And I hadn't really become a full-fledged jazz engineer at that point. So I was doing everything. And basically I treated every artist as that individual, and tried to serve them and the producer to do what they liked,
So when you're working on these magnum opuses, with like you talk about 48 tracks, and we're also talking about the time where it's you're linking tape machines together, and it's not as I won't say easy, but it certainly has more consequences than what we have today. Working coming from the jazz and more of the cut from the floor mindset, how important to you was it at that point in time in your career to get the best sound from the floor? You talk about processing, and a lot of engineers just get the sound to process later. How important was that for you, even in a pop record?
Always. I always, there's a bunch of engineers that, and maybe more English ones, that call themselves balance engineers. And that's what I always considered myself. I want to take these elements, and for me, balance is like everything,
Sure.
So yeah, it was nothing. I didn't really think about it specifically, but if I had to use effects and delays and whatever, there was minimal of that kind of stuff going on back then.
Sure.
But it was all second nature. And, and then as I got more exclusively into the jazz world, a lot of that stuff went by the wayside. But there are times when I do something, it's like sometimes I'll do some singer-songwriter-y things that use jazz bands as the musicians. And I pull that stuff out when I need it, But I'm not versed in a lot of manipulation that goes on today in terms of like extreme limiting and that kind of processing. That sound is not something that I am able to do or that I hear. So I would be less appropriate for popular records today than I was in the early 80s.
Well, and as we talk about your journey through the jazz world and sort of immersing yourself primarily in that world from a recording and mixing standpoint, one of the things that sort of lines up with your diving deeper into that world is the change in the delivery medium, meaning we go from, album to cassette. Yeah. And there comes a time when we're no longer recording for vinyl anymore, which is predominantly, in my opinion, a detriment to a lot of jazz, because I think jazz is one of those amazing, because of the way it's recorded and the way it's performed, it generally tends to sound fantastic on vinyl. As we move through the first phase of the digital era with CDs, did that affect any of the decisions you were making from a recording standpoint with these artists?
Yeah, I mean, the early converters were a little harsh sounding, and we also had to adjust at that time to the fact that, when you were working on analog multi-track tape and you played it over and over again, it would get a little bit duller over time, and you got to the mix and you'd have to brighten it. But digital recording stayed as it was. You had to learn that it wasn't always necessary to re-brighten in the mix. That was one of the things. And as converters got better, things, became a lot better in that world. The one period that was a little bit dark in a sense was when we mixed everything to 16-bit DAT. But there were records, the James Taylor records were mixed to 16-bit DAT, and I wouldn't change a thing,
Wow.
So much of it, I've always said that if I do the best job possible and the musicians and the producer, that it could all be done on cassette and it would be fine. And cassettes are actually, even though they're making a little bit of a comeback, are actually pretty great when they're aligned, especially compared to MP3s. So,
sure. Oh, yeah, of course.
But yeah, I would say that I don't know what I would say, but yeah, I hope that answers that.
Well, it does, absolutely. And I find it interesting, again, simply because so much of the jazz culture and aesthetic, at least in the States, is rooted in mythology, right? It's never, from the late 50s to early 60s, it sort of waned in its popular focus as rock and roll became more prevalent. So then you just create these legendary figures that nobody really thinks about or talks about outside of the legends. Your Miles Davises, your Herbie Hancock, you have all these big household jazz names, but so much jazz music, to your point, has been and is continuing to be made on a regular basis.
Yeah.
That at some point in time in your career, do you think to yourself you've heard it all as far as arrangements, performances, players? Is there any moment where you're kind of on your jazz spectrum of your journey and you're like, okay, well, I think I've heard everything, and then something comes along and blows you away?
No, I don't think anybody in the music business thinks that. There's always something you haven't heard. I mean, just think about how somebody writes a new song and there's a new melody. I mean, you think 12 notes. How can they come up with something different? But the players are such individualists that I don't think that occurred to me. And of course none of us ever stop learning. There comes a time sometimes on a session where I don't change things up that much because I have to work fast. And I know what works, and what works is good. But occasionally something happens where I think, should have been doing this all along. Why did it take me so long to discover this? So I think it's always a learning process to some degree, even though most of us are somewhat set in our ways.
Well, and speaking of set in your way, so here's a question. So I know, I mean, again, Duck, Here Comes Some Love. Looking through your discography, you have worked with some of the greatest musicians that any genre has to offer. So I'm going to hone in for a second on my world, which is drummers, and some of, Marvin Smitty Smith, Jack DeJohnette, Omar Hakim, Steve Jordan. I mean, these aren't just drummers. These are legends in any genre, let alone the jazz field or the fusion field. And when you talk about your process of recording from the floor and getting the best sound in the room, how do you, when you're getting ready for a session, in your mind, based on your process, how do you sort of delineate, okay, I have a Steve Jordan today versus an Omar Hakim? Would that be still the same microphone setup for you, even though they're adversely different players, or do you look at it and just wait to hear what's going to happen in the room?
I'd say the microphone setup wouldn't change, because what changes is their conception of the kit, how they tune it, and how they set it up. And sometimes with any player, some players are used to certain things because they have a lot of experience, and they might say to me, can we try this microphone? I've really had good luck with that. And sometimes I'll just say, go right there. And sometimes they'll say, let me try the one that I was thinking of. And then if we don't like it, we'll switch or we'll compare. So I would say the musician already has the variation in their sound built in. And just to backtrack a little bit, I got to add to your drummer list,
So many.
Jack DeJohnette, Billy Higgins, Danny Richmond, Ed Blackwell, and Elvin Jones. So,
and Elvin Jones.
Yeah. Briefly on all of them, but I really did get to work with amazing legends. And
wow,
every one of them was like, I can't believe I'm here.
And that's really cool. I mean, and I'm sure I'm not about to tell you anything you don't know. Clearly, there are many people in our industry that get used to being in the industry and lose that scope of wonder, where it's like, wow. And even again, a cursory sampling. When I found out that you had a credit on a Graham Parker and the Rumor record, I was like, well, you got to be kidding me. Who hasn't this guy worked with? I was like, this is insane.
I was an assistant engineer on that record.
Still.
But the cool thing about that is I got to assist Jimmy Iovine and Shelly Yakis. So I got to see what that little world was all about.
Wow.
And, every little thing you experience like that is so cool. And I love Graham's music. He was one of my favorites. But just to backtrack a little bit, one of the things I would say about, the difference in musicians, let's say, take Steve Jordan as an example. He probably would have preferred a somewhat roomier sound than maybe someone else might have preferred something tighter. So I would follow his lead, that he wanted to hear the drums more ambient and less close in at times. So it was always a dialogue and between player, artist, producer, and me to come up with what we thought fit that record.
So, and you talked too, I think we touched on it briefly. One of the components of working in the jazz world predominantly is time. Like we talked about, and I don't mean kept time, but the actual amount of time you have to actually record, mix, get everything ready. And a lot of that's due to budgets, and it always has been. I mean, that's not new. Jazz has always been the neglected stepchild of the record industry budget-wise. So how do you, as an engineer, in your mind, you're getting into this, you're doing this, you're having some success. Is there ever a time where you're like, well, that was too fast? We should have taken a little more time.
No, we got to get it done in the time allotted, and that whole area is one of the reasons I'm glad I'm not the producer. I'm not responsible for any money and all that kind of stuff. So I just go and I do everything as fast as I can. But one of the things about working at Power Station, I know this is going to happen. Let me turn down my answering machine so I don't hear it. But
it's okay.
I'm going to ring 4 times.
That's fine.
I still have a landline. That's how old school I am.
It's nice.
One more.
Don't worry. It's Steve Jordan. He heard we were talking
about. That's the last one. Yeah, Steve's a man about what I said. Anyway, Okay, where was I?
Time. You were talking about not being
Oh
happy
yeah.
you're not a producer.
So, I'm going to go in there and I was trained by, Tony Bongiovi and Bob Clearmountain, and those guys were fast, man. I mean, Tony could get an entire orchestra doing takes in
Wow.
less than an hour. Bob was so fast to get a sound, and what these guys taught me was instinct, work fast, um, and get people recording. Don't make people sit around. They want to come in and they want to play and be efficient. And yeah, so I plan setups so meticulously with the input list and the drawings and the sight lines and everything in consideration. I get there really early. I set up so that I can work fast. I almost leave nothing to chance, and this is what these guys instilled in me. You know, the other thing that they taught me very early on, and this was not common at the time in the late '70s when I started assisting, but they said, you'll hear about a lot of people recording without EQ, without reverb. They're just getting stuff to tape and it's going to be done later. You said, but that's not what we do here at Power Station. We want the client to hear it sounding like a record from the moment they're recording. So if you're going to compress something, you compress it to tape. You monitor with the reverb the direction of the reverb you're going to want in the mix. You put a compressor on that mix while you're recording, and you make it sound like it's a finished product. Something I'll add to that is these days, my live rough mixes, my live monitor mixes on my sessions are maybe 10% different from my final mix. And I would say sometimes 10% better, sometimes 10% worse. Even if you heard the live monitor mixes on the James Taylor sessions, very close to the final product.
Wow. That's awesome.
So working fast was not a chore for me, not a challenge.
So when a band comes in throughout the course, when a new group of musicians comes in to cut something, do they have oftentimes sort of a reference point from your career that they're asking you to replicate? Do you ever get that from bands like, hey, can you make it sound
I don't like that when they do that. They say, I want it to sound like this record. And my line is always, okay, well, that record sounded like those guys in that room on that day, and you're going to sound like you guys in this room on this day. And I'll take the direction. The most common request I got is, I want my piano to sound like Keith Jarrett.
Of course.
And everybody wanted that. And I say, okay, well, that's Keith and his piano and that record company and their sense of reverb. And, I'm sorry, I can't, I can't copy something.
Sure.
So you do get those requests. I would say in pop music, people more have references that they're like the producer comes in and the artist, I want something that in that, vibe right there. But I don't do that on jazz records.
I was going to say, how many people come in and ask can you make me sound like a Brecker? Do they just
yeah, well, that's in the playing. And there's a lot of people who have absorbed Mike to a certain degree. And, and then in more recent years, Chris Potter is the aim, I want to be like Chris. So that's up to them, though, to sound like that guy, if they want.
Do you, or I'm sure there have been moments, but does any moment come to mind where someone came in and maybe you had to fight a little harder to get the right sound of the instrument in the room?
Yeah, there's sometimes people come in, most people know who I am, what I do, and want me to do what I do.
Sure.
But occasionally somebody gives me a lot of direction, and sometimes it's good that I don't hear something like they heard it, and I have to work on it for a while, maybe change a mic or position or maybe some EQ or reverb to get what they're hearing. And then there are other times where that goes too far, where somebody, like one artist, this happens more than once, but wanted me to mix something, and he came in and he was giving me so much direction, like, okay, adjust these mics like this. I want this one like this much less than that one, and pan it like this, and put this delay on here, and and what happens is I just stop thinking after a while. You just tell me what to do, and in the end, you have to like the record. I don't have to like it, and in my mind, I probably will not like this record and never listen to it again. But it's their record. I never lose sight of that. So chances are I don't work with that person again.
Sure.
Because I expect that people want me to do, go in the direction that I feel comfortable in.
Well,
so
one of the hallmarks of your recordings is, for me, is your use of space. And obviously when you're taking everything in at the same time off the floor and you've got people spread out in the room, do you pay attention? That's the wrong question. Of course you pay attention. When you're looking out through the through the glass, when you're looking through the players through the glass, are you trying to pan them in the same position you're seeing them on the board, or how does that relationship work?
Really good question. If I'm doing a live 2-track mix and it's jazzy, I'm only if the client likes this, I'm going to pan them as it's set up in the room, and it's going to sound like a 1960 record. And it's going to be a mono drum kit on the right speaker, and the piano's going to be on the left. And but the reason for that, those records at that time is there were no pan pots. They hadn't really invented it. So they had a choice of left, center, right. I happen to like that sound. I feel like it's clear. And what's beautiful about it is if everybody's in the room, the drummer's leakage is not on top of the drums. It's there, and the bass and the piano. So it's not mucking up the clarity. It's so much clearer. So I am thinking like that, although there's two types of records we do, where everybody's playing together in the room, and then the type where everybody's isolated in booths. I would say the latter is more common, mostly because music has gotten very complex and people need the ability to repair things. And I'm not saying so much like redo a solo, but fix melody parts, make things more precise, maybe edit something where the timing is a little off, or tune a note that got out of tune. So the isolation is important for that. And once I'm isolated, then I don't go for the stage, because that only works with the leakage. The leakage has to define the space. On those records, I'm more, it's more likely that I'm going to have a stereo piano and stereo drum set and make things that are more along the lines of a pop record. But many jazz records sound like this, and it's a language that everybody accepts. That the idea of these stereo instruments that are larger than life, and they're fun to listen to, and I like that too. Do I like the natural stage panning more? Probably, but if people aren't playing in the room, that's not going to work.
And so when we talk about sort of these competing worlds, what comes to mind right off the bat is obviously the piano, which is kind of a staple in most jazz recordings. But then a lot of time horns as well occupy a lot of that same frequency range. So especially when you have a situation where there's a piano and a horn player in the room together at the same time, is that crazy to you, or are you so used to it and like, okay, well, I know where I need to put these people, how I need to, so that you're not fighting with it later in the mix?
Whenever people are in the same room, the guy who's playing louder than the other guy is going to sound roomier, and the guy who's playing softer than the other guy is going to sound closer. So that's a challenge that I have to try my best to balance it where that's less noticeable, but it is always going to be noticeable to a certain degree. So this is it's an area where I'm relinquishing control due to the fact that if they set up the way they want with horn and piano together, that's better. They're going to play better. And when they play better, no matter what I do, it sounds better.
Sure.
So, um, one of the reasons I've been able to make great records is the caliber of musicians I work with is it can't get any better. So I'm very lucky. And occasionally I have to do something um, where the players are not like that. And I struggle to, reach my standard, but it's not necessarily on me.
Sure. Well, and so along the same lines, obviously, given what you do, there are many places you could work in New York City, but Power Station, where you started, it's your home, you've been faithful to it. How much of Power Station is the James Farber sound? How much, I mean...
Yeah, I would say, let's put it this way. I like to work on old Neve desks, like 1970 vintage desks, 8068, 8078, 8038, that 8058, that series of Neves. And I try and do as much as I can. And that's a big part of it. And each studio I work at, I learn their mic collection. And I know that Power Station has two U47s, and I know the difference in the way they sound. And I know that if I'm working at Sear Sound, they have, maybe four U47s. None of them sound exactly like those two at Power Station, but I know which ones I like on which instruments there. So you just learn this. I would say I've made as many records at Sear Sound as I have at Power Station. And now there's a few other studios I work at. Power Station's a luxury. It's always great and easy there. It's not always going to be that. So I don't depend on it. And I think one of the things that, we have to point out, unlike almost every other engineer, I own nothing. I don't own a microphone, nothing. So my whole thing is the way I was learned. You go to the studio and they're supposed to have enough stuff there that I can make a record with it. And so that's why they're all a little different. I'm not attached to the gear.
Sure.
And
you work with what you have. So, I get it.
Yeah. So I'm very flexible when it comes to that. I'm going to find the best mic in that studio to capture what I need, and it's not always my first choice. Even monitors, I have to switch monitors when I go to different studios.
That's rare. That's incredibly rare for an engineer.
Yeah, I don't know if it's because I'm just a lazy fuck or what, but I don't even carry a bag to the session. If it doesn't fit in my pocket, I don't take it, and I leave sessions and clients are always saying, "Didn't you forget something?" They're all carrying bags, and I don't carry anything.
That's brilliant.
So I'm kind of like, in my own little world when it comes to that. And I've heard that I did one other audio podcast. No, print. It wasn't audio. It was a print interview years ago, and it was reposted somewhere, and then someone on like one of those forums like Gear Sluts or something said, "Why would we listen to what this guy has to say? He doesn't own any gear." So people are too hung up on the gear.
Preach. From your really, mouth to God's ears. Yeah.
Too hung up on, I have to have this compressor. I have to have that mic, and that's not how I function.
Well, Steve Jordan would sound the same on a toy drum set as he does on his regular drum set because he's Steve Jordan. So I'm with you there. And that brings up another great point too, is you sit in this amazing position in New York between all the studios where you again have been recording this style of music and all these other styles of music at both the height of the music industry as an industry in general, and now that it's flipped and changed and it's completely a shadow of itself.
Yeah.
What would you say if you were going to pick just on a personal, what's the one thing that's changed the most in your job here in doing what you're doing over that time period?
Well, I'll just say one thing along those lines is that when I started out and I was making jazz records, there was still money there. And the reason was that the rest of the record industry was doing so well that it could subsidize the jazz, which always went along at its low level, but it was not sunken, but it was okay. And, people bought it. And so now that's not the case anymore. It's up to the musicians to figure out, how to get their product recorded and out there. But it's not going to change because these musicians are driven. This is what they do. It's their life. They're going to find a way to do it, whether it includes me or not. But that's one of the things. I want to get back to your original question, and I kind of forget.
What's changed? The one thing through all the ups and the downs, the one thing you've seen change the most in the scene there, the recording, engineering, and the music scene there in New York?
One of the things that maybe bugs me the most that increased over time was all the level wars. I do everything at 0 VU because I'm mixing on an analog desk, and I mix 75% of what I do to tape because I like that sound. So it gets to mastering, and in order to compete, the level has to come up, and it changes what I did. I don't use limiters. It's up to the mastering engineer to do that. So that is something that changed from the early days quite a bit, that this is a necessity. And my records often don't sound as loud as the next guy's, but there's a point where the music suffers and we say, okay, we're not going to go anymore.
Sure. Oh, of course. And to your point.
And I'll just say that the digital equipment got to the point where the dynamic range of it is greater than it's ever been on any medium ever. And now people don't want to hear those dynamics in the end, but they played them. They played super extreme.
Yeah.
It's there's been a lot of changes. I would say the other change is that things used to be a little more fun, a little more relaxed, a little less stress in many ways. But
yeah, it's got to be an anomaly because, again, not only are you sort of in the heart of it, but there's never been a phase of music history in the States here where New York hasn't been it's sort of the center of the industry in one way or another, whether it's one genre or style of music, Broadway, live, all these different types of things. New York is sort of a fixture in the musical industry landscape. And obviously over the past 20 years or so, ever since the advent of the digital revolution, New York hasn't been immune either. Studios closed, they change hands. And in particular, Power Station has changed hands, I think, 3 or 4 times.
3 times. Yeah, Power Station, then Avatar, then back to Power Station Berkeley.
Yeah. And it's here you are. You've weathered all these changes, and you're still doing the same thing that you started doing and wanted to do when you were a young man. Does it? Do you ever have one of those moments where you're like, I can't believe I'm still doing this, and that I still get to do this?
Yeah, I'll just say, go backtrack and one other thing. When Pro Tools started to take over, because I was recording everything at that point on Sony 48-track open reel dash half-inch digital tape. And I became an expert editor on that. And but then it got to the point where people wanted to see the waveform and wanted the instant this and that. And I was slow to say that interests me. In the same way that I don't mix at home now, where everyone else does. That doesn't interest me. And that limits my work kind of in a good way. But so there was a time where my work was rapidly disappearing because I had not caught up with Pro Tools. And I remember going to an AES show at Javits Center one year. And it was the first year that I saw that there was not one single tape recorder on the floor, not even a digital one. And I remember running into George Massenburg and saying, I guess I would finally have to learn Pro Tools. He said, James, you have to learn Pro Tools. You have to do it. And that was like a light bulb. And then, I still, the bulk of what happens with Pro Tools is done by my assistants who are light years ahead of me on it. But I can get by. And, but yeah, that was a big change when went to the digital audio workstation.
Well, now, like you said, it's always cyclical. So there's a resurgence of people wanting to try and record on tape, and vinyl's trying to make a small. So as these things come back around, are you hopeful, or do you think that it's ultimately always just from here on out going to be a boutique little industry, that section?
I don't know. I mean, I'll say this about the vinyl that comes out these days. I work with some audiophile artists that have no digital component to their chain at all. So we record live 2-track analog tape, and the vinyl gets mastered from the tape.
Wow.
On those records, the vinyl so far beats any digital version that comes out. But most of what we do is mixed in the digital format, and the vinyl that comes out is somebody takes the digital master and cuts it with no supervision from anybody involved in making the record. No, we don't take lacquers like we used to before the digital era. We don't evaluate the stuff, and it just kind of comes out. And so most of the time these days, except for rare instances like ECM, Blue Note, some record companies take extra care on the vinyl. Most of it, I much prefer to listen to the CD than, or the high res file than the vinyl. The vinyl is often not, it's a little mushy, or it's not representative of what we did, but it can be,
Sure.
But it needs a separate mastering, but nobody's going to pay for that.
Well, have you ever listened back after the fact? So you've recorded, mixed something, and then you hear it in one form or another, and you think to yourself, that doesn't sound anything like what we did at all. That it's been manipulated or malleated so much that it's not.
Well, it's always close. I'm one of these people, a little bit of another area where I'm a dinosaur, where I attend most of the mastering sessions for my records. So, I mean, the thing about mastering is if I do a really good job, the mastering engineer main function is to get the level up in an elegant way that sounds like he didn't do that. And then maybe some minor EQ, if necessary. But, I'm lucky to work with these great mastering engineers, like Greg Calvi or Mark Wilder, or Bernie Grunman, that have so much taste and understand that when something's good, they don't need to screw around with it. And if it needs help, they know what to do. So I don't experience that so much, but there are times where I'm working with artists who have to use cheap mastering, and I'm not involved at all. And a lot of times with that, I'm disappointed in the final product. Compared to what my mix is. I mean, the master should always sound at least as good as the mix, and hopefully a little better. And when it comes out worse, it's a disappointment. But sometimes the vinyl's a little bit of a disappointment because nobody's on top of it in a certain way. But for the most part, I'm pretty happy with the final product.
Well, and to your point, in many ways, in this day and age, mastering is a lost art, because you say mastering to some artists or younger musicians or people, and they have a completely different concept of what the process is supposed to achieve versus what it was originally intended for. And you even have some people that argue with the diminishing need for broadcast standards that mastering isn't, if you're streaming, it's not even necessary. You'll hear some people go that far. Do you have any thought process on sort of this new digital delivery and the validity of some of these processes that we kind of hold near and dear to us?
I'm not sure I understand that question, but I will say that the master engineer is still quite important, because the mixing engineers on so many records are just novices working at home that are not trained, and they learn from YouTube and gear sluts or whatever. And so the master engineer often gets things that are pretty horrible and need to try and make it sound professional. So I feel like their world has really changed, but the good ones are really good at trying to make something out of it. And sometimes they'll do that and present it to the artist, and the artist will say, "Oh, I don't know. It changed my stuff too much." It's like, maybe because it wasn't so good, but it's a. So I think the mastering engineer is still quite important.
Okay.
That way, I didn't answer the question, but
no, you did. Again,
yeah.
I gave you a long, convoluted question, and you gave me a direct answer.
I'll
it's
take
true
it
to form. So it's good.
Yeah.
So let me ask you this: so if we rewind a little bit in your career, obviously there comes a point in time where you win some awards. You're an award-winning engineer now. One of those is a pretty big honor. So how does being associated with a Grammy, how does that change your world as it's happening?
Well, I have to clarify that I have, I think, 6 Grammys and a Latin Grammy, but they're not engineering awards. So they're awards to the artist. Somebody might win in the category of best small jazz group or best large ensemble, whatever the artist wins for. And if I've done more than 50% of the record, I also get a Grammy that has my name on it. But it's unfortunately, and I don't think this will ever change, there are 2 categories for engineering: classical and non-classical. Well, non-classical is never going to go to a jazz record. It's always going to go to the engineering award's always going to go to a popular record. That's what's going to get the votes. So I will never win an engineering Grammy, but I'm proud to have these other Grammys because I feel like the sound that I produced in conjunction with these artists helped them to achieve their Grammys.
Yeah, and I want to talk about the first one, right? So you get the first one, and how does that change your career? I mean, is the phone ringing more, or are people suddenly paying more attention to you? No.
I mean, I would say it's always been it's always been word of mouth. And here's another thing I'll harp on. But so there used to be credits, right? And so my name went on all the records. So if people liked them, they would find me. Now I've also never had a manager or a website or any social media presence. So I'm not easy to find. You can't look up on the internet and find my email. So you have to know somebody who knows me in order to get in touch with me, which I've always liked being a little bit behind the scenes, as much as my nature. But where am I going with this?
We were talking about Grammy.
Oh, but
phone ringing more.
I feel bad for up and coming engineers because people don't see the credits like they used to. People saw my name on records they liked and found me. And now it's a struggle for listeners and artists. Artists will search it out, but it's not so easy to find the credits. You have to dig. You're not holding something with the booklet that says, recorded and mixed by.
No, it's different.
And so I had free advertising that's gone away for the up and coming engineers. So it's always been a thing where it is. I don't think it has anything to do with the Grammy. I think it has something to do with people liking the sound of the record and thinking that, oh, well, this guy did it, so maybe he would be a good choice for me.
Sure. And I asked that question because conversely, to your point, in popular music, the Grammy ultimately just means, well, that's popular, which means whoever that guy was can probably make our record popular too, which means we'll make more money, so let's get that guy. But you being associated with these awards in categories that aren't necessarily the cash cows that some of these other categories are, I was just curious if it was the same cause and effect in that industry as well. Not that I've ever known anyone that's gotten into jazz for the money, I can tell you that.
I mean, one of my Grammys is a World Music Grammy because I mixed the Gypsy Kings record. I haven't been, my phone's not been ringing off the hook to do more world music, even though with the Haitian stuff, that's how I started out before world music was even a term. So, So no, I think the awards and the accolades haven't had an effect on me. It has on the artists for sure.
Yeah.
No, I think that they can ask for more money and get better bookings and have more clout. But that hasn't affected me. Although it's great to receive these. I have a couple of, you know, back in the old days, a couple of gold and platinum records for
Wow.
stuff I worked on. But,
Yeah.
once again, just it's the Artist's Award that I participate in.
That's a very humble and very kind
Yeah,
way to put
that's
it.
my thing. I'm sort of humble.
That's
But
not,
a lot of the great engineers are. I mean, if you've ever spoken to Bob Clearmountain, this guy is like one of the most humble guys you will ever speak to. And I learned a lot from him about how to handle yourself and what to take credit for, and just let the work speak for itself.
well, and that brings up a great point. So as you're going down this jazz journey, how much of working in that genre, that obviously this would apply to all genres, but everything has its own sort of temperament. How much of what you do is personality based? Meaning, how important is it in that world to just be affable and be getting along with everyone? And
It is so important, Rick. I mean, like in the pop world, you could make a great sounding record for somebody and have gotten along with them too. But if it's not a hit, you won't get called back. And sometimes in that world, I've wound up like on a session with somebody who I'd worked with previously, and it's their record. And they said, "Oh, I didn't even know you were going to be here. I got called by the management or something." And I said, I'm thinking, well, you have a choice. But in the jazz world, my being called back doesn't have anything to do with how many people buy the record. It has to do whether with the artist like the sound and that we get along. And I've gotten along really great with the artists I've worked with. A lot of us have become friends. I don't want to say this completely because I'm not alone in this, but one of the things that I do that not everybody does is I go out and hear them play live all the time because I'm such a fan of the music. And a lot of the engineers who do what I do don't. They don't go to the clubs. So, I'm in this great situation where I show up and people seem happy to see me, which is a great feeling. Really feel like I'm part of a community.
wow.
And it's a lot more than just the art and technical aspects of engineering, but there are these long-term relationships. I've made up to 15 records with some artists over the years.
Wow.
And that doesn't happen even in successful pop music collaborations that often.
Well, and to your point, one of the other, I think, incredible components of the jazz and fusion communities is artist longevity. These people are career musicians that plan on putting music out until they can't make music anymore, as opposed to pop artists whose can't is a different kind of can't. Their can't is financial. No one's paying for them to make records anymore, so they don't. Whereas the lifespan of the folks you generally tend to work with is this journey. And with that in mind,
I just worked with a 99-year-old musician 2 weeks ago. I recorded the Sun Ra Orchestra at Power Station, and the band leader's been with the band, one of the original alto players, Marshall Allen. He's 99, and he's still the figurative band leader of the Sun Ra Orchestra. So yeah, these guys keep going.
well, so have you ever had a moment where you're in the middle of a session and you look up and you realize that there are people out in the other room that are heroes of yours, or you've lost yourself and had to remind yourself, oh, wait a minute, I'm at work. I need to get back to work.
Yeah, I pinch myself all the time. I know I have a job to do, and I'm just trying to be as professional as possible. And I look out there and I'm in awe. I never, it's like a dream come true. The idea that I would have started out and gotten, gained popularity by working with Michael Brecker back in the day. Sure, it's something I dreamed of, but the idea that it happened had a lot to do with being at the right place at the right time, and also being good and also relating to people.
Hmm. Do you think, had you not had the opportunity to pursue your love of this particular genre of jazz, and you got pigeonholed in the pop world, do you think you would still be doing it, or do you think you would have moved or migrated careers at any point in time? Do you think you could still be working in pop today? Would you want to?
So it's even hard to imagine. I probably would have had to have applied myself completely different, and I just can't imagine it. I always say that, I think a lot of us doing what I do would say it's like, we can't do anything else. It's like, if I wasn't doing this, I'd be wrapping presents at Macy's. I don't have any other skills. I was really lucky this worked out. I'm so thankful that it did, that I was able to do something that I loved. On the other hand, when you do something you love, you're often a bit of a slave to it. And, you, like early on for many, many, many years, I had no life, it was just constant this, but it all paid off. It was a good investment.
As you kind of contemplate your next session, so let's just say you've got a session come up in a few days. I'm just curious of how your particular mind works. The minute you know you've got a session coming up, when do you start thinking about the gear, all the little details? Because again, you are incredibly meticulous. We know this; it's a fact. So when does that process start for you?
It depends on the situation. If it's someone I've worked with a lot, and I'm like, in August, I'm recording another Artemis record, which is Rini Rosner's all-women's all-star jazz group. And this will be the third record I'm making with that group.
Wow.
I don't have to do that much because most of it's based on what we did in the past. Sometimes it's a new artist and music that I haven't heard, and I'll always ask, can you send me rough mixes or demos, or get an idea of the music so I know how to plan. And then some things are small groups. I can do these. I can think about it the week before. I'll always make sure I reserve the equipment that I want at the studio as far in advance as possible, so I have all the mics I need and that stuff. But for instance, the Sun Ra recording I did a few weeks ago, I knew that was going to be huge. So that was 50 microphones live, 25 players, and strings, horns, rhythm, voices, and I knew that it was going to be a puzzle. So I spent many, many hours on that setup, and I even had to go to sound check for their gig at Summer Stage to learn more, because and even with all that, with that particular group, I knew there would be surprises when I got to the session, and there were, like, more horn players showing up than were advertised, and I'm already like at 10 more inputs than the console is, and I've got to like rewrite the puzzle at the last minute. So I think about it as far in advance as I need to for each particular thing. When it's a large ensemble, I once did one for one really large ensemble, and one of the guys came up to me like after the session and he said, "We were doing takes in an hour. How was that possible?" And I said, "Just unbelievable amounts of advanced preparation." And he said, "Yep, okay, I get it." And you know, in the pop world, I think people are a little bit more patient. Like, they might spend a day getting a drum sound, or not expect to, get a take on the first day and that kind of thing. Not always, but that happens. In the jazz world, if I can't get people like doing takes within an hour, they're like itching to play, so I got to make sure that happens. I got to get people recording. On the other hand, if there's something to be ironed out that I'm not happy with, or there's a technical problem or whatever, I will not start recording takes until I'm happy that we have what we want, and that people have come in and listened to a playback and given me their feedback. Like, are they happy with the direction that it's the initial direction that we took, or do we need to tweak things? Um,
Sure.
and it's a cultural thing too. I remember the first time I worked in Paris in the 90s, and it was this huge electronic world music group, Weather Report, but beyond. And we spent all day hooking up, getting the setup together. And of course, a little bit of a language problem too. At the end of the day, they did a take and they came in to listen. And I said, so what do you guys think? And they all looked at each other and they said, you're the first person who ever asked, the first engineer who ever asked us this question.
Mm.
So in their world, the engineers just did what they did and nobody commented on it. So,
I love it.
Yeah.
Well, and I think to your point, pop music tends to be maybe a little more contextual and convenient to the moment or the song, whereas jazz music generally tends to be an extension of the community that plays it, right? So those guys, this is what my drums sound like. They just happen to be the drums that is playing with this group of guys today. So here you go.
Yeah. And, oh man, I lost that train of thought. I was going to say something really good.
It'll come back.
Do you remember what you just said that might trigger it again?
I was talking about how pop music is more contextual, where things may change from song to song, but jazz is more organic, the community.
Yeah. So whatever I set up on a jazz session for the first song, that will not change. We will not stop. I mean, maybe the drummer might change a snare drum, but we're not going to, like Steve Jordan might change a drum kit that's more appropriate for that pop song than the next, right?
Right.
This is not going to happen on my dates. Whatever the levels are, whatever the sound is, and then there might be some song that's a different animal, and that's going to have to be sorted out in the mix. But we're not going to take the time to re-get the sounds for that song. Sure. Otherwise, we'll never finish.
Of course. Well, and so let me ask you this: with all the new artists discovering you, people coming and getting in contact with you, do you turn things down? Is there anything you turn down? I'm not nothing specific, obviously, but if someone throws something at you, do you listen to it? And if you're not into it or you feel it's out of your wheelhouse, will you turn it down?
Yeah, I say no. Especially these days. At my advanced age, I don't want to work that hard anymore. And a lot of that's built in with budgets because I might be more expensive than the next guy, or because I can't mix because they need somebody. They need to spend like 2 weeks mixing this, and they need a guy who can mix in the box. And it's not like I can't mix in the box; I just don't do it. So I'll say, well, I can mix this for you, and I can mix this album, in 4 days in the studio, but you have to accept some rough edges and want something where the big picture is beautiful that I can present. And if you're willing to make that kind of trade-off, then we can do that. But if you really need to, balance every bar so your music is, balanced to the way you imagined it, you might not have the same big picture, but that might be the way that has to go. But there are times when now where somebody contacts me and I'm just not that interested. I say no. In the old days, I never said no. Of course, I wanted to work as much as possible, but these days, there's YouTube. So somebody contacts me who I don't know, I can go check them out and see if I like it immediately and see if it's something that I feel would be appropriate. And if I do turn something down, I would never say it's because I'm not interested. It's always, I'm not sure this is a good thing to keep in the final thing. But I would always say, I don't feel I'm appropriate for this, in some way.
But if you're not interested, it's not a lie. If you're not interested, you're definitely not appropriate. I think
I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings, though.
Well, of course not.
Because sometimes I'm not interested because I'm not necessarily a big fan of the music or the playing. So I'm unfortunately spoiled.
But it's a great position to be in. And as we kind of encapsulate this, here's a question I have for you, because this you've led me to this question through this conversation. So you're not really heavy onto social media. You're not doing a lot with
I'm
the
not
internet.
existent, not
Yeah,
existent.
non-existent. You're not, you're not trying to teach people things on YouTube. You don't have a manager. You don't have an agent. And when you are done working at the studio, you don't bring your work home with you. There's no Pro Tools rig at home or small controller. You're not doing so. When you're not enveloped in the world of your work, what does James Farber do for fun? When you're done at the studio, what is it? What do we do? What do we do with our
Oh,
time?
let's just say that I do have to do a lot of listening at home. I have to listen to rough mixes, I have to listen to final mixes, and I have to listen to mastering. So there's a lot of work that does happen at home. It's just not it's not engineering work, but there's a lot of listening that happens at
Are you
home.
just listening through a stereo then, or a set of speakers
Yeah,
at home? Oh, wow.
yeah. You can see one of my speakers. I don't know if
Yeah.
I'm pointing the right way back
Yeah,
there.
it's over
I
there.
have like a real stereo, and it's been my reference, and it's I got it in the '80s. It's now it would be considered a cheap stereo, but for what it cost then. But it's very good, and it's not super fancy. Uh, but what do I do? I go out and hear a lot of live music. That's like my favorite form of entertainment.
Oh, wow.
Probably in a jazz club, several times every month. I play my piano at home. I still, love to play my piano. I listen to music, but not as much as I used to because uh, I guess I associate it, unfortunately, with work. But it's not like I don't do it.
Sure.
I watch a lot of TV like the next guy. I have tons of friends I socialize with. I go walking in Riverside Park, get some exercise.
So you have a pretty busy life either way, even when you're working and not working. Normal stuff.
Yeah, normal stuff.
Well, again, we're so used to, and not that I don't have a play one way or the other. We're so used to hearing people that still, I work at the studio for 10 hours a day. Then, like you said, they come home and then I mix for another 5 hours, and then I'm testing it. I'm like, and that's cool. I mean, that works for some people. But there seems to oftentimes in that decision-making process, you find there comes a fork in the road where you have to decide between your actual physical health and quality of life and whether or not you're able to balance those things to move on.
Yeah, early on there was no balance. It was all work. And you needed to do that to get to the point where I got. And now, like back then, I would never say that I can't work on a holiday, or I would cancel a vacation if a gig came up, all that kind of stuff. Always make myself available. And now I put, the personal stuff ahead of that. I still, expect to be compensated for what I do in the way that I always have been. And yet the reason I do this now is not for the paycheck. It's
Sure.
because I love it.
Wow. So as we wind this down, what I ask everybody this because I think none of us are as good as all of us. So I think any wisdom is better than no wisdom. As you look through your career and you look at all the opportunities, the successes, the failures, everything, and a group of young guys want to get into the jazz space and do some jazz recording, and they're going to come to you for some advice. What's the one thing you can give them that you think they can take to the bank that's always going to be reliable from an advice standpoint?
Well, if it's about making jazz records, I feel like you have to listen to the canon. You have to know the history of jazz. You have to know what the great players did, who influenced who. You've really got to know your stuff. It's not, you can't just say, I know Michael Brecker and beyond. You have to know, Armstrong, Ellington, Parker, Coltrane. You got to know all of it. And so you got to listen. You got to do your homework, and you got to be immersed in that. If you want to record jazz, I get a lot of calls from somebody like, oh, Mike, friend's cousin wants to get into this business. Can he talk to you? And I always take the call, and I try and give advice. And I first question I always ask is, how old are you? And if they say they're more than like 23 years old, I say, well, you have to really think about this, because in order to do what we do, you have to live in an urban area, and you have to be prepared to be poor for a while. And it's a struggle. And so if you're all of a sudden over 25 years old, and, you're not going to want to be a gopher, necessarily, and you're not going to want to be poor. And you might struggle for 5 years, and then at 30 find out you didn't get anywhere. So you got to be young to start out in this business, I think, and give yourself a chance to succeed and be poor when it's appropriate to be as a youngster. And I'm exaggerating a little bit, but
Sure.
but you know what I mean.
Absolutely.
So that's the kind of advice I tell people. And of course, I want to know if they're musicians, because that helps. I myself, I'm a musician to a certain degree, not anywhere near the people I record, but I am not a really studied musician, so I'm not a score reader. And a lot of my assistants, they're, like following the score, marking bar numbers, the musicians can tell them punch in at, beat 3 of bar 52. And I mean, I can do that if I count from somewhere that I know,
Sure.
but I can't do it on the score. So, learn as much music skills as possible, I think is key. And also learn how to get along with people, and, copy what you can, and find your voice. I will tell anybody what mics I use, how I do anything, because you really can't copy somebody. There's so many little nuances of what I do that, you might do what I do, but it's a different player, so it's not going to sound like that. Or without this bus compression happening at the same time I'm doing that, it's not going to sound the same. So it's such a sum of the parts that make what you do sound like what it does. I say, you can try and copy, but you really can't. And that's why I have no secrets. And I don't think people should have secrets. And I know that over the years, mostly at Power Station and Sear, I've mentored a lot of assistant engineers that have worked with me over and over again, that have absorbed a lot of things from me. But then as they've progressed, they've gone on to figure out, hey, they want to incorporate that, and then veer off and do their own thing. And a lot of them have become stellar engineers. And I'm so happy for them. And they have a lot of the work that I used to have. And it's the way it's supposed to be. So I pass down everything that I know, and there's no secrets, and there never should be. And my model for passing the stuff down is, this is the way it is in the jazz community, right? So there was a progression of Louis Armstrong to Roy Eldridge to Dizzy Gillespie to Miles Davis, and all the mentorship that, just one example of what happened along the way. And all these things got passed down. All the people who passed through Art Blakey's band, and these great band leaders, and, the great musicians we know, the Marsalises or whoever, came up through this system of learning. Michael Brecker and Randy, played in Horace Silver's band before they became the Brecker brothers. So this is super important. Know where you came from, pass things on, and keep passing it on, and keep learning.
I love it. That's some of the best advice we've heard. And now I have one final question for you based on something you mentioned earlier. Okay. You mentioned Frank Zappa earlier. So
Yeah.
If you could have worked on a Zappa record, the first part of the question is, would you have? And then the second part would be, what era of Frank Zappa would you have liked to work on?
Yeah, I would say, you know, Uncle Meat Hot Rats is maybe my favorite. However, I did meet Zappa on a session, so I think
Oh, wow. Technically, that
before
counts.
we wrap up, I have to tell you the story.
Please.
So Frank recorded everything. You know, I saw him live in various forms, probably 25 times. And he recorded everything, and I knew that. And he was recording when I was an assistant at Power Station. I had been there less than a year. He was recording, Joe Ciccarelli at the time was his engineer. They were recording at the Palladium, a live show, and Power Station was new. So Frank wanted to come in and check out the studio. He just wanted to bring a few multi-track reels and just listen and just check out Power Station, which was becoming a known quantity. So I got wind of this, and I went up to the office and I said to the manager, you got to put me on this session. And she said, well, you're the new guy. Why do I have to put you on this session? I said, because I'm the guy who loves this stuff and no one else gives a crap about it. And it's really important, to me. And it's like, finally she gave in and said, all right, we'll put you on the session. I mean, basically I was going to load tapes on the machine and answer questions or whatever and sit there, so anybody could have done it. But it was rare to grant a request to the new guy like that. So I'm waiting in the reception area for Frank to show up, and Frank and Joe Ciccarelli come in carrying a bunch of tapes, and Tony Bongiovi, the owner and designer of Power Station, is standing there as they came in, and Tony had worked on some of the early Zappa records, maybe only in it for the money or, briefly.
Oh, wow. So
Zappa comes in and sees Tony and he says, Bongiovi, what the fuck are you doing here? And Tony says, I own the place, Frank. And it's just a moment I'll never forget.
Oh, man.
And then we went into the control room, we're listening, and I'm just like,
yeah, I can imagine.
One of my heroes is right there, and I'm able to talk to him and listen. It was just great. And this is going to get a little goofy, but I said, Frank, I have to show you something. And I start to take off my belt. And I said, I have to show you this belt that I'm wearing. So I lay it out on the console. My father was he had so many hobbies over the years. And one of the things he was into was leather work at one point. So I said, hey, Dad, can you make me I have this belt. Can you, can you make me a belt that has a staff on it and put notes and copy some music off a score, because there's 16 bars of music of the Uncle Meat theme in the Uncle Meat record. So can you put this on a belt? And he said, yeah, I can do that. So he did it. And so I put this on the console, and Frank's looking at the music, and it's like he realizes what it is. He said, where the hell did you get this? I said, my father was a leather worker, and he made it for me from the music inside the Uncle Meat album. And Frank says, well, tell your father he's sick. Oh, that's the end of that story.
That's a good story. That's a good way to end a podcast as well. I mean, first of all, the odds are so slim to none that encounter could ever happen in your life that it's worth hearing the story.
I never met Miles Davis. There's a lot of people I never met who I wished I had met, but I've done pretty well.
I'd say. And next time we talk, we can talk about how close to the jazz universe Frank Zappa's blend of rock, fusion, and everything else actually, talk about Rock and Roll High School, the players that have come up and through that and gone on to do. I mean, that's a whole other podcast. James, listen.
As Frank said, jazz is not dead, it just smells funny. Yeah. But he employed many jazz musicians, so he knew what he was doing.
We are just so humbled and thankful that you spent some time with us today.
My pleasure, Rick. This has been a lot of fun.
it's just great getting to hear more about your career and you. I mean, we're very, very fortunate. So from us to you, we love you. Thank you very, very much for taking the time out. I'm going to rudely turn this way and address the camera now, and then I'll be right back. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, you learned something today, and now you're going to apply it to your lives and be better people for it. Again, we got to spend some time with world famous mix engineer, James Farber. He doesn't like the world famous part, but I was trying to do my NPR voice. So that didn't work either, but you know where we're going with this. James spent some time with us. We learned a lot. We got to hear some great stories and get kind of an insight into how he's been able to do what he does so well for so long. And that is, that's priceless. So thank you for your time, for stopping in and joining us. We appreciate you. We know you're watching this on your phone at work. I always say that. That's the only reason to have a phone, and that's generally what people do at work these days, or it's considered work. So thank you for taking your lunch break or hiding in the restroom or just not letting the boss see what you do and watching the podcast. We appreciate you for it. The joke's never going to get old. I'm going to say it at the end of every podcast, and you know it. Thank you so much. We appreciate you. We look forward to seeing you the next time on the next episode of the Sound Horizons podcast, brought to you by Toontrack. Please be well, treat each other great, and have a great day.